And welcome to this Political Pulse. We are joined by House Majority Leader Scott Odenbach, a West River lawmaker from the Spearfish area. Thank you for coming on today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
A lot of big issues, a lot of macro issues that I want to touch on. And I think where we should begin is just with water usage in western South Dakota. I know this is something that's recently, the U.S. Geological Survey put out a new study on this, an updated study on this, and this is something that's caught your attention. What'd you make of that study?
Well, it says that we're all grown up out here, as they say. We've had a long tradition in South Dakota of working really hard at development and at growth, and that's a good thing. It's necessary, obviously, to have a good economy, have a growing economy. But when you take a look at that study, it's not necessarily surprising. And we've got a lot of monitoring wells throughout the Black Hills if you start digging into this issue. And I think what the study showed is in a few places, a few isolated places, we're starting to have a greater drawdown of some of the aquifers than the natural recharge rate. And when I saw the study, it got me thinking about a statute that I'd run across before in South Dakota law that basically prohibits water mining. And that kind of sparked that discussion.
Gotcha. From what I've read, and we were talking about this before we came on here, it looks like the portions of the aquifers that are mostly being impacted are in these urban areas. So my question to you is, when you look at the statute that you're talking about, do you see anywhere out here that should possibly be applied?
Well, yeah, the statute was put in place back in the 70s during a time of drought, really, if you research it, and it basically says that you can't draw water from an aquifer faster than it's recharged. If you do, that's basically what's known as water mining. However, the statute has an exception in it that says any formation lying below the Greenhorn Formation, is what geologists call it, is exempt from that statute. And so, I've done some research into this, and essentially what that did is it protected the aquifers that are mostly used in eastern South Dakota. I think at the time, the issue of aquifers in western South Dakota was not even on anybody's radar. Our population was so low relative to the water flows that were observed to be there that it wasn't even covered. And so, based on the exemptions in that statute, the aquifers we have out here, the Madison, the Minnelusa, the Deadwood formations, the one that we use for residential, for commercial applications, agricultural, are exempt from that. And so part of the discussion when you start hearing that, hey, some of our areas might be drawing down faster than they're recharging, is to say, well, what do we do about it? And one of the options would be to take a look at a statute like that, because what's the alternative? To let people's wells run dry? Obviously nobody wants that, so we're in a situation where, at least in some areas, we better start getting smart and proactive on what we do.
Yeah, so my question to you is I know this is something that from our discussions, it sounds like it's more so something you want to have a conversation about before you actually attach legislation to it. So what kind of conversations do you think need to be had around this topic?
Well, I think we need to make sure we understand the science there and have conversations with the staff at DANR that's looking at those monitoring wells. And we don't need some statute. I think the news story that came out yesterday or today is kind of a lesson in, you say one thing to a reporter, the headline might say another thing. Obviously we don't need to just say we're not having any more wells and stopping development in the Black Hills. Nobody wants that. But I think we can get smart and understand really just where are the areas where water mining might be taking place, and then possibly deal with that with a laser beam, rather than a bazooka.
From some of the conversations me and you have had, it seems like growth is something that's on your mind, and it's something that you want there to be a methodical approach about. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say. I mean, I think the civic religion, I've told somebody recently, in South Dakota has become, just growth at all costs. And when you talk to constituents, as I do in Lawrence County and throughout the Black Hills, people want us to start being maybe a little more cautious about that. And also, I think letting the free market work perhaps more than having government be involved in priming the pump and trying to have there be growth at all costs, without also looking at the quality of life of the people who live here now and what that growth has done to people's property taxes. You know, we took a look at a few property tax bills in the State Affairs Committee last session. And what we found is, and this is more so I think an indictment of the property tax system that we have now and the way taxes are assessed based on valuations, and if your neighbor's value goes up, so does your tax bill. But what we found is the places with the greatest growth, Minnehaha County, Pennington County, Lawrence, also had the highest property taxes. And they also had the highest number of people who came in and said, we need even more money for services, for essential, whatever we decide that is, government services. So we've got to fix that issue.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think it is that when the more a community grows, the more the property taxes actually go up? Because you'd think by volume, there is that possibility that just by volume, now you have more money coming in that might be able to actually lessen the burden on the homeowners who are there.
Right, exactly, and that's been the argument, if you will, that's been given for a lot of these economic development promotions, is that, well, this is going to help broaden the tax base and lower everybody's taxes. You hear many people say that, but unfortunately the evidence in South Dakota hasn't shown that, because as you know, if you're a conservative like me, you've learned by reading and seeing history, government will spend every penny that it gets and say that they need more. And that's what we heard in the hearings we had in Pierre last session is, you know, yes, there was growth, but with that came a greater need for things like law enforcement and new construction for streets and utilities and all the costs that go along with that, not to mention the costs for public schools. So all those things taken together have, you know, the state budget has gone up substantially if you look at where it was in 2017 compared to the last one we passed, and so have most of the school district and county budgets. So taxpayers need a break.
Is there any argument that the state budget went up? I know, I mean, some of this I would guess is just from population growth, correct? Just because I know during the pandemic, quite a few people, from what I've been told here, did move to the area.
Yeah, inflation and population growth, Medicaid expansion, there were a lot of infusions of cash into our budget to deal with a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. And so do you think that some of this growth is needed and there's some other growth that is to be scrutinized?
Well, I don't know that it's for me to say.
I'm talking about budget growth, by the way.
Okay, yeah, I mean, whatever. I mean, I'm for the free market as far as growth goes. And that's a whole other debate about how much should government be directing that or be involved in that. But yeah, we need to take a look at the budgets and give taxpayers a break. I mean, I think one of the plans that's been floated, ideas that's been talked about, for example, to bring property tax relief. You know, you've heard that the summer group that we've had, one of the goals is a 50% reduction in property taxes. Well, one way to do that would be to have the state take away the local levy for education, which comprises roughly half of people's property tax bill. Just delete that, have the state take that on, you know, through a series of cuts to state government, taking a look at some of the exemptions that we have. Maybe, you know, there's been some other ideas floated to create like a dedicated 1 cent tax for education. Those are the kind of things that are out there being floated, but so one mechanism, like I say, would be to do that by taking away that local education levy.
A few things I want to touch on, but we'll start with the property tax group just because you're touching on it. Yeah, that 50% goal that was proposed earlier this summer, how likely do you think it's going to be that lawmakers are going to be able to reach that goal?
Well, as a wise man once said, you've got to have the votes. And reaching consensus on that issue is one of the toughest knots to untie in Pierre. And whenever you have hearings on that, whenever you address that issue, there's a line of lobbyists for various interests out the door. The public school people come in and say, well, we're actually severely underfunded. You know, if you take a look at what we spend on education in the state, with higher ed thrown in with K-12, it's half the state budget. So you've got a lot of interests that say, don't touch our spending, don't touch our spending. And so we're going to have to though look at the spending if we want to meaningfully address property tax relief for people.
And that's where I guess I've got questions about the budget is when you say you're looking at spending, have you been able to identify places where that spending might be able to be reined in?
Well, you know, last session, the session before, former Governor Noem had some targeted spending cuts, and when you do those, you know, we saw that it raises a lot of opposition pretty easily because people have that target to look at. So I'm more of a proponent of taking a look at just across the board reductions or limitations on the growth of government in order to have the money available to do other things.
So when you say targeted versus across the board, what's the differential there?
Well, so for example, if you're saying we're going to target and we're going to zero out this program or zero out that program, well, obviously then all the people who are proponents of that specific program are going to be, going all in a life or death struggle, if you will, to save their program. Versus if you just say, hey, across the board, the budget's grown too much relative to what we're asking from taxpayers. Let's ask government to take a hit across the board. I think that's maybe an easier sell.
I think what I'm hearing is what you're saying is you take each of these programs, if you're trying to get a 15% reduction, and I'm just speaking hypothetically here, is you say all of our programs, we're taking down 15%.
Right.
Everybody's going to have to figure out how to work with this efficiency model.
Yeah, that's my philosophy.
And you're saying that'll minimize some of that lobbyist interest or some of the other blowback that you might get if you just say, this program eats up 15% of our budget, let's just completely eliminate it.
That's one way to say it. Maybe others, cynics might say, no, you'll just have every lobbyist for every program in. But I think if you're going to start looking at something as broad-based essentially as the property tax system, which we've become very reliant on as a state, and you're going to try to deal with it, you have to look at spending just as broadly.
So when you're looking at legislation from this property tax task force, and I know you were sitting on the committee that heard Senate Bill 191. I was there one night. You were what exact committee was this? I'm drawing
That
up
was
like
the State Affairs Committee.
State Affairs Committee. This is before it went to the House floor.
Yeah.
So it was like, I think it was like the night before it went to the House floor, if memory serves me
Yeah, I
correctly.
think it passed out of State Affairs by one vote and then went.
And it had quite a bit of lobbyist pushback that night.
Yeah, it was a long day.
And that taught me, I mean, I was covering the state legislature. This was my first session covering the state legislature here in South Dakota. And what I realized really quickly watching Senate Bill 191 that night specifically was that you have to really figure out how to craft legislation that won't take on so much, I guess, pushback from the lobbyists because they made a lot of noise.
They made a lot of noise, or you have to have the courage of your convictions to say, no, we're going to do this because the people back home who voted us in need a tax break. So obviously, the lobbyists are the loudest voice, but I often find myself over the last 5 years in the legislature saying, who's the lobbyist for the average person that gets up at 6 every morning and says goodbye to their family and goes to work all day to pay these taxes? Well, they don't oftentimes have organized lobbying groups, and so I tell my fellow legislators we're their lobbyist.
So is there also a way to possibly craft legislation, and are you eyeing any legislation at this point that you think might pass that scrutiny test that like, we'll say 191, for example, took on?
Well, we have a fairly divided legislature at this point, so it's going to take everybody trying to go in the same direction, and it's going to, it's a governor level issue as well. And maybe that'll happen this session. Maybe it has to wait till we have a governor that hopefully gets elected with a mandate as making that one of their main issues to help get this shepherded through.
We'll move off property taxes, but talking about growth again as a whole, do you think there's a disconnect between some of these business interests and the constituents who live in the Black Hills when you're just talking about growth as a whole?
It sure seems like it. I mean, that's probably the number one thing that I hear from constituents when they come up to me or when we see people downtown is they thank me for at least getting a conversation started on this issue of growth with the resolution that I introduced last session and with some of the things I've been saying about water this session. So, everybody that's an organized lobbying group pushes for their interests. And so, groups like Elevate Rapid City, for example, they push for the interests of their members. But they have tunnel vision in one sense of just looking for expansion of business opportunities or whatever, however you want to characterize it. Whereas I think our role as a state legislator representing everybody is to take a look at not only the narrow focus that groups like that might have for just business interests, but look at the interests of everybody and also make sure that business interests like that and what they claim they want isn't the only thing that we think about or the only group that we talk to. Certainly it's important, but the big discussion is how much of a role does government play in priming the pump, in subsidizing things, et cetera, versus just as a government creating an environment that's conducive for business by having, low taxes, low regulations, smart regulations, great schools, safe streets. That'll be a beautiful environment, as you see when you drive up here to this studio. That's what attracts people to be here, not an over-reliance on government priming the pump. So I guess that's what I see as maybe a bit of the disconnect between specific groups and maybe the people at large.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you're looking at any proposal, any sort of legislative proposal when it comes to business districts, what's your balancing mechanism between my constituents want to see growth, maybe done in a sustainable way, maybe done in a way that maintains their quality of life here in the Black Hills, but also balance this need for jobs, this need for economic development in any area to maintain the economy?
Well, I think that analysis comes back to first principles, to your instincts as to the role of government. And, business interests and people will always advocate, if they can, I think, for government to give them a break, to give them a subsidy, whatever. That's, they would argue that that's just the natural thing to do, perhaps. And so what you have to do, though, is remember your principles. If you say, okay, I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative, I think we're in the midst of a struggle in some ways in this state to define what that means. I think it means conservation as well, and that's why I think we need to be careful as we grow with our resources, with our water, with our beautiful Black Hills. I mean, what do we want it to look like in 10 or 20 years here? And so we're at a point, we have to find balance. We have to find balance between saying we want to be, only promoting growth for the sake of growth versus what's the overall quality of life for the people who live here, who put us into office, that we want to make sure we guarantee for them going forward. Certainly when they have kids and grandkids and they want them to be able to come here and open a business, we need to have an environment conducive to business formation and development. And so that's the balance we need to keep.
Are there other issues that you're identifying in this next legislative session that you think haven't really hit the media radar?
Well, I don't know if I'd want to. If I've opened enough can of worms, like in the last couple of weeks. I think that's, we've got enough going on without me opening up more.
Well, you talked a little bit. One can of worms that you opened, so we can keep it open, is the divided Republican Party, and you are House Majority Leader. How do you see that divide? We hear it talked about a lot. I read about it a lot. And more so, it seems like it's rumblings. You don't really hear it well defined. How would you define it?
That's a tough one to talk about as Majority Leader. I think that probably the biggest divide is this on the issue of economic issues. I mean, I think, I've been in South Dakota politics and involved in politics now for, 30 years probably. So I'm old enough to remember a time in South Dakota where we were still fighting even within the Republican Party over the issues of, pro-life, for example. And in many ways, those battles have been won, you could argue, and we're basically a pro-life party. And I don't really see that very much within our caucus or the Senate caucus. But where you do see it, I think, is on the role of government in promoting economic development and economic growth. That's probably the biggest divide. And and I just think that as Republicans, we're all for the free market. We're all for, some people have used the term organic growth. And then the fight, if you will, is over just how much should government promote that? And that tradition in this state goes back, to Governors Mickelson and back to Janklow, and maybe even a little before that, where we'd look up to states like Minnesota, Colorado, as we felt kind of like the little brother, if you will. And there was this big drive to do economic development, poach jobs, poach companies, et cetera. And as I said earlier, we've grown up in one sense. And so sometimes what was smart in 1986 may need to be adjusted for 2025. And you can say, well, we're there in one sense. People have discovered South Dakota. Former Governor Noem did a lot to do that around the country, obviously. And I've heard some good and some bad from people about that. And so we've been discovered, and people understand we have a great quality of life, and we have great natural resources and a great tax and business climate here. So when we have property taxes that high, when we have homeowner insurance that high, when we have electric utilities issues, we need to be careful at how much we're spending from government to prime the pump, if you will, to help corporations that really may not need the help. And so that's, I think, the divide within the party, and I think the thing that we most need to navigate.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're really honing in on one issue, and it's just this economic issue. From your perspective, what kind of work goes in on your side, just trying to, keep the party aligned, so to speak?
Well, I've told somebody sometimes being majority leader feels like a cross between a party planner and a counselor. It's, we have I think the largest caucus we've ever had, 64 members, and so your days are packed. And between meetings with the executive branch, meetings with your whip teams, meetings with your committee chairs, and then running caucus every day before you go down to the floor, it takes a unique focus every day. And just trying to be cordial with everybody, understanding that there's differences. There's 64 people, there's 64 opinions. And so you have to use all your diplomatic skills that you can. And we all fail at times. We're all human, but that's the goal.
Okay. Well, I think we're ended there unless there's anything you think we haven't gotten to. Any other cans of worms that you want to pop open?
This is enough.
Okay, sounds good. Yep. Well, he is House Majority Leader Scott Odenbach. This is Political Pulse.